I don't even know who shocked me more, my mother-in-law, who stormed into my life and immediately started asserting control, or my husband, who lied to her about the apartment we live in. The apartment was mine, purchased with help from my parents long before I got married. But according to my husband, it was all his doing. That's what he told his mom, at least. And with great pleasure, I made sure she knew the truth. 3 years ago, I met Jacob. What started as casual friendship eventually grew into a deeper relationship, and within 2 years, we were married. Jacob, 31 at the time, had moved to the city from a small rural town, where his career ambitions were modest but steady. Before we lived together, he rented an apartment with a friend, splitting expenses while working a middle-class job. I wasn't exactly struggling myself. By the time we started dating, I had a stable career and a significant advantage, an apartment that my parents and I had purchased together. My parents had covered half the cost, and I paid off the rest with a loan. It wasn't fancy, but it was a spacious 2-bedroom near a subway station, which was more than enough for me. When Jacob and I got married, I had just made my final loan payment. The apartment was entirely mine, a fact I was proud of but never flaunted. After all, a marriage is about building a future together, not keeping score. Or so I thought. We didn't have a big wedding, just a courthouse ceremony, followed by a quiet dinner. Money was tight, and neither of us wanted the hassle of a large event. Since Jacob's family lived out of town, I hadn't met most of them yet. My only contact with his mother, Ruth, had been over the phone. She'd seemed nice enough, a kind woman with a straightforward attitude. That impression shattered the day she came to visit. One afternoon, Jacob casually mentioned that his mom would be arriving the next day. She already bought her tickets, he said, as if this last-minute announcement was perfectly reasonable. I stared at him, dumbfounded. She's coming tomorrow? Why didn't you tell me earlier? He shrugged. She's easygoing. She doesn't expect anything fancy. We've got food in the fridge, and I'll handle the greeting. You'll meet her in the evening when she's settled in. His nonchalance infuriated me. This was my first time meeting his mother, and I wanted to make a good impression. Don't you think it would be better to prepare? I asked. Clean up the house, cook something special? Jacob waved me off. She's not picky. Don't stress about it. The next day, I left work early to make it home before Ruth arrived. But when I walked in, I was greeted by an unsettling sight. Jacob wasn't there, but Ruth was. She was standing in the kitchen, inspecting the contents of my cabinets like she owned the place. Her bags were unpacked, her things spread out, and she had the air of someone who had already decided she was in charge. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile. Hi, Ruth, I said, setting down the cake I'd bought on the way home. I'm Lisa. It's so nice to finally meet you. She turned to me, her gaze heavy with disapproval. Without so much as a greeting, she began listing all the things wrong with my housekeeping. The house is a mess, she said. Everything's out of place. You call this a home? I stared at her, stunned. I stood there, cake in hand, as Ruth continued her tirade. Honestly, Lisa, she said, waving a disapproving hand at the kitchen. You need to learn how to keep a proper home. Everything's cluttered. This isn't how a respectable woman lives. I felt my jaw clench, but I kept my tone steady. We're in the middle of renovations, I explained, gesturing to the half-finished paint job in the living room. Things are still a bit chaotic, but it'll be sorted soon. She sniffed, clearly unimpressed. Excuses don't make a house a home. I tried to defuse the tension by offering her tea and a slice of cake, but her criticism didn't stop. When she started making snide comments about how I'd arranged the furniture, my patience snapped. Ruth, I said, my voice firm, I appreciate your opinions, but this is my home. I decide how things are arranged here. Maybe if Jacob had told me about your visit ahead of time, I'd have had more time to prepare. But since he didn't, I'd appreciate a little understanding. Her eyes narrowed. You're home. Don't be so sure about that, dear. I blinked, thrown off by her tone. What do you mean? Ruth crossed her arms, leaning back with a smug expression. This is Jacob's apartment. He told me himself that he bought it. Just because he married you doesn't mean you're in charge here. For a few seconds, I was too stunned to respond. Then the anger hit me like a freight train. I'm sorry, what? Ruth frowned, as if my confusion annoyed her. Jacob said this apartment is his. He bought it before your marriage so he'd have a home ready for his wife. And if that's true, Lisa, I think you need to be more respectful about how you run things. I stared at her, my mind racing. Jacob told her he bought the apartment? The apartment that I had paid for, with my parents' help, long before I even met him? I see, I said finally, my voice calmed despite the fire burning in my chest. Well, let me clear up that misunderstanding. I walked into the bedroom, grabbed the file containing the property documents, and returned to the kitchen. Placing the papers on the table, I pointed to the section clearly showing my name as the sole owner. This apartment belongs to me, I said, my tone sharp. I bought it with my parents' help before Jacob and I even met. He doesn't own a single square inch of it. Ruth's smug expression faltered as she scanned the documents. What's this? Did he put it in your name for some reason? I laughed humorlessly. No, Ruth. It's mine. It always has been. Her face darkened as the truth sank in. Before she could respond, Jacob walked through the door. Mom, Lisa, Jacob said cheerfully, kicking off his shoes. What's going on? Before I could say a word, Ruth turned on him. Jacob. You told me this was your apartment. That you bought it to build a life with Lisa. Is that not true? Jacob froze, his face paling. He glanced at me, then at the documents on the table. I crossed my arms, glaring at him. Go on, Jacob. Explain to your mother why she thinks this apartment is yours. He stammered, tripping over his words. I just didn't want her to think I wasn't contributing. You know how she is. Ruth's expression shifted from anger to disbelief. So you lied to me? About something as important as this? I didn't wait for him to dig himself into a deeper hole. Grabbing my coat, I turned to Jacob. You two can figure this out. I'll be staying at my parents' place tonight. Without waiting for a response, I walked out the door, leaving them to their argument. The next day, I returned to the apartment, unsure of what to expect. The space was eerily quiet, almost like the calm after a storm. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed two things: Ruth was gone, and so were her things. Jacob was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. When he saw me, he quickly turned it off and stood up, rubbing the back of his neck. Lisa, he began, his tone defensive, we need to talk. I set my bag down, crossing my arms. You're right. We do. Let's start with why you thought it was okay to lie to your mom about something as fundamental as who owns this apartment. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I didn't think it was a big deal. I didn't want her to think I wasn't pulling my weight. You know how she can be, always judging me, always comparing me to other people. So your solution was to take credit for something you had no part in? I shot back. Do you even understand how humiliating it was to have your mother barge in here and act like I was some freeloader in my own home? Jacob winced. I didn't mean for it to get that far. I thought it would just be easier to let her believe it. I didn't think you'd ever have to get involved. I let out a bitter laugh. Well, congratulations, Jacob. Not only did I have to get involved, but I had to prove my own ownership of this apartment to your mother. Do you know how ridiculous that is? I get it, he said quickly. I messed up, okay? But did you have to embarrass me like that in front of her? You could have pulled me aside, Lisa. We could have handled it privately. My eyes narrowed. Oh, so now I'm the bad guy? You lied to your mother, put me in an impossible position, and I'm supposed to protect your ego? Jacob, this is your mess, not mine. His face reddened, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he sighed heavily, dropping onto the couch. You're right, he muttered. I screwed up. I just didn't want her to see me as a failure. I softened slightly, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. Jacob, this isn't just about your mom. If you can't be honest about something as basic as this, how can I trust you with bigger things? Marriage is about partnership, not pretending to be someone you're not. Jacob nodded slowly, his expression serious. I know. I'll talk to her. I'll explain everything and make sure she doesn't pull something like that again. I shook my head. It's not just about her, Jacob. It's about us. I need to know you're going to be honest with me, always. If you can't do that, this isn't going to work. His eyes widened slightly, and I saw a flicker of fear cross his face. It will work, Lisa, he said earnestly. I'll fix it. I promise. For now, I decided to take his word for it. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I'd rushed into this marriage too quickly. Meanwhile, across town, Ruth was nursing her wounded pride. She couldn't believe her son had lied to her about the apartment, and the humiliation of being corrected by Lisa in such a definitive way only made things worse. She's not as meek as I thought, Ruth muttered to herself, pacing her small hotel room. But that doesn't mean she's right for Jacob. The idea of Lisa owning the apartment bothered her more than she cared to admit. It wasn't about the money, it was about control. If Lisa held the keys to their home, what did that mean for Jacob's independence? He's letting her run the show, Ruth thought bitterly. And that's not how it should be. But even as she plotted her next move, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind: what if Lisa wasn't the problem? Jacob kept his word and called Ruth the next day. I wasn't present for the conversation, but judging by his tense posture and the clipped tone of his voice, it didn't go smoothly. After he hung up, he slumped into the chair at the dining table, running a hand through his hair. Well? I prompted. She's not thrilled, he admitted. But I told her the truth. About the apartment, about everything. She's still upset, but she said she'll back off. I folded my arms, leaning against the counter. And you think that's the end of it? Jacob, your mom doesn't strike me as the back off and move on type. She'll come around, he said with a weak smile, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. I wanted to believe him, but experience told me otherwise. For a few weeks, things settled into an uneasy calm. Ruth didn't call or visit, and Jacob seemed to be making a genuine effort to rebuild trust. He helped more around the apartment, listened to my concerns without brushing them off, and even started planning a small weekend getaway for the two of us. But I wasn't naive. The silence from Ruth wasn't peace, it was strategy. I wasn't wrong. One evening, just as Jacob and I were sitting down to dinner, the doorbell rang. Jacob looked at me, confused. Are we expecting someone? I shook my head. Not that I know of. When Jacob opened the door, there she was, Ruth, standing with a suitcase in one hand and a bakery box in the other. Surprise, she said brightly, stepping inside before either of us could respond. Jacob looked at me with wide eyes, and I could see the panic bubbling under his polite smile. Mom, what are you doing here? Oh, I thought I'd come spend a few days with you too, she said, setting her things down as if she owned the place. I brought pastries. I forced a smile, biting back the irritation rising in my chest. How thoughtful of you, Ruth. But maybe next time, a little heads up would be nice? She waved me off. No need for formalities, dear. We're family. Dinner was strained, to say the least. Ruth filled the conversation with stories about her latest hobbies and distant relatives, peppered with subtle jabs at Jacob's life in the city and my housekeeping. You know, Jacob, she said at one point, cutting into her chicken, when you were younger, you were so much more ambitious. Always talking about buying your own home, building a family. It's funny how plans change, isn't it? Jacob's grip on his fork tightened, and I could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. Mom, we're doing fine. Lisa and I have built a great life together. Of course you have, she said sweetly, though her tone dripped with condescension. I'm just saying, it's important for a man to take the lead. Don't you agree, Lisa? I met her gaze evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. I think a strong marriage is about partnership, Ruth. Jacob and I make decisions together. She smiled, but her eyes were sharp. Oh, of course. But sometimes, one person just knows better, don't you think? Jacob cleared his throat, shooting me an apologetic look. Mom, maybe we should save the life lessons for another time. After dinner, Jacob took Ruth's suitcase to the guest room, leaving me to clean up the kitchen. When he returned, he looked exhausted. I didn't know she was coming, he said quickly, as if anticipating my frustration. I know, I said, wiping down the counter. But this can't keep happening, Jacob. She needs to understand that she can't just show up unannounced. I'll talk to her, he promised, though his voice lacked conviction. I gave him a pointed look. Make sure you do. Because if this keeps up, it's going to cause real problems. He nodded, but I could tell he was torn between keeping me happy and placating his mother. And that was the problem, Jacob's attempts to keep the peace were only delaying the inevitable conflict. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ruth bustling around the kitchen. When I walked in, she was rearranging my spice rack as though she lived there. Good morning, dear, she said without looking up. I noticed your spices were all out of order, so I fixed them for you. Cinnamon next to cayenne? That simply won't do. I clenched my jaw, keeping my tone even. Good morning, Ruth. Thanks, but I liked them the way they were. She shrugged, clearly ignoring me as she moved on to another cabinet. Oh, don't mind me. I'm just trying to help. By the time Jacob stumbled into the kitchen, I was on the verge of snapping. He gave me a sheepish smile, grabbing a mug of coffee. Morning, he mumbled, clearly hoping to avoid the tension hanging in the air. I didn't take the bait. Instead, I waited until Ruth had retreated to the guest room before turning to Jacob. We need to talk. Jacob, I began, keeping my voice calm but firm, your mom has to go. He froze mid-sip, blinking at me. Go? Lisa, she just got here. She's been here less than 24 hours, and she's already driving me insane, I said, crossing my arms. She's rearranging my kitchen, criticizing everything, and acting like she owns the place. This is my home, Jacob. Our home. And she needs to respect that, or leave. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know she's overbearing, but she means well. She's just trying to help. I shook my head. No, Jacob. She's trying to take over. And if you don't set boundaries with her, I will. His face paled. You're not serious. I am, I said firmly. You need to make it clear to her that she can't just show up unannounced, treat this place like it's hers, and undermine me at every turn. If you won't handle it, I will, and I promise you, it won't be pretty. Later that afternoon, I overheard Jacob talking to Ruth in the living room. His tone was hesitant at first, but as the conversation went on, it grew firmer. Mom, you can't keep doing this, he said. Lisa and I are trying to build a life together, and you're making it harder. Ruth's voice was sharp with indignation. Making it harder? Jacob, I'm your mother. I only want what's best for you. And what's best for me, he said, is respecting Lisa and our home. You can't just show up unannounced and start rearranging things or making comments about how we live. It's not fair to her, and it's not fair to me. There was a long pause, and I held my breath, waiting for her response. Fine, Ruth said finally, her tone clipped. If that's how you feel, I won't overstay my welcome. Ruth left the next morning, her departure marked by polite but icy goodbyes. As the door closed behind her, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Jacob turned to me, looking both exhausted and relieved. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I should have set boundaries sooner." I nodded, softening slightly. "You did the right thing, Jacob. But this has to be the new normal. No more avoiding conflict just to keep the peace." He nodded, pulling me into a hug. "I'll do better. I promise." For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. The days after Ruth's departure felt like a breath of fresh air. For the first time in weeks, the apartment was quiet, and the tension that had hung over our lives seemed to dissipate. Jacob made a noticeable effort to keep the promises he'd made. He was more present, more engaged in our daily life. He started helping with house chores without being asked, and he even planned a small date night, a cozy dinner at our favorite restaurant. It wasn't extravagant, but it was a gesture that showed he was trying to make amends. I appreciated his effort, but part of me still felt guarded. Ruth's meddling wasn't something that would disappear overnight, and I needed to see if Jacob would truly stand his ground the next time she tested our boundaries. Meanwhile, Ruth was stewing over the events of her visit. She wasn't used to being told no, especially not by her son. The fact that Jacob had sided with me stung more than she cared to admit. Sitting in her modest living room back in her hometown, she replayed the conversations in her head. She had always prided herself on her ability to guide Jacob through life, but now, she felt like she was losing her influence. "She's too strong-willed," Ruth muttered to herself, thinking of me. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Though she wouldn't say it out loud, a part of her grudgingly respected my willingness to stand up to her. She wasn't used to meeting someone who wouldn't back down. Still, she couldn't let go completely. "We'll see how long this lasts," she thought. Over the next few weeks, Jacob and I worked on rebuilding the trust that had been strained by Ruth's visit. He took the initiative to call her less often, and when they did talk, he made sure to include me in the conversation. It was a small step, but it made a big difference. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Jacob turned to me with a sheepish smile. "You know," he began, "I never realized how much I let my mom influence my decisions until now. I guess I just didn't want to disappoint her." I paused, drying my hands on a towel. "Jacob, I get that. But you have to understand, when you put her feelings above mine, it makes me feel like I'm not a priority. That's not how a marriage works." He nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. And I want you to know that I'm committed to making us my first priority from now on." A month later, we celebrated our first wedding anniversary. It was a quiet evening, just the two of us, a homemade dinner, and a bottle of wine. Sitting at the table, looking at the man I had chosen to spend my life with, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. We weren't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, especially when it came to dealing with Ruth. But we were learning, growing, and most importantly, standing together as a team. "Here's to us," Jacob said, raising his glass. "To us," I echoed, clinking my glass against his. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on solid ground.